All right, good morning. Appreciate you all taking time out this morning to attend. I'm Ryan Heiniger. I'm the OVT director at NC State. This is one of our data webinars that we hold after each data release. This one will, of course, be focusing on our wheat data that we released back on June 15th. So the goal here is that we're going to go through what the season looked like for us on the OVT side, kind of some of the things that we saw in general across both statewide and regional looks. And then we're going to dive into the data itself to look at if I was making a selection as a grower, how am I making that selection from multi-year data by region all the way down to single year data by statewide. And so just going through kind of a way that I would look at the data inside the variety selection tool, as well as some options you have outside of the variety selection tool to look for that data that we released. So I'm going to start um, I'm going to start first, and I apologize if it sounds like I have a frog in my throat. I've been under the weather here the last couple of days. We're going to start with looking at how the year went this past year. So hopefully you can see my bar graph screen here. But if you look at our overall yields statewide, we're actually third highest yields over the last 7 years, coming in about 86.1. Obviously not as high as the last 2 years, but still pretty solid. Third highest if you look across all 7 years. You can split that into how that shook out by region. So I have Piedmont, Coastal Plain, and Tidewater here listed below. Kind of visualization of where those locations were across the state this year above it, and then each county within that region listed below. I obviously don't have last year listed here as well, but Piedmont and Coastal Plain came up a couple bushel from what we saw last year. Tidewater actually dropped fairly significantly from where we were last year. Tidewater last year was about 106 bushel, this year around 81. But then we detailed kind of what the yield levels were at each one of our locations down below, along with the test weight. And then in parentheses, I've got where we've pulled some additional data outside of just performance data. So we do look at heading date by GDU. That data is reported in tool. We'll look at that here in a little bit, but that data was pulled from Union and Lenore this last year. And then we pulled falling number samples from Union, Rowan, and Perquimans this year. Unfortunately, our falling number machine broke down as soon as we started using it. So that data is not quite ready. It's not available on the variety selection tool just yet, but hopefully here in the next couple weeks, we'll start getting that processed through. But overall, fairly consistent yields across regions. We don't see a region that really did a whole lot better than the others. Piedmont's a little bit higher, which we would expect year over year, followed by Coastal Plain and Tidewater, but overall pretty consistent yields across the year, across the regions. If you look at test weight, and I didn't list it like I listed yield on the previous screen, test weight's a little bit down from where we were last year. On average, we were around 57 pounds. Last year, we were about a little over 58 pounds, so a little bit lower on the test weight. Given the hot, dry weather we saw towards the end of the growing season, that's to be expected. We didn't have a chance really to fill out a lot of those varieties. So that's what our yields looked like across our different regions. I also like looking at how maturity played a role in yield across these regions because we have seen instances where early maturity can be an advantage or a disadvantage based off the region when it's grown or the environment that we were looking at for that year. And so here I've graphed all of our varieties. So your bottom is your GDUs from early, which is around 2150, all the way out to late, which is about 2600. Each dot's a variety, and then these are split out by regions. So red is Piedmont region, green is the Coastal Plain region, and purple is the Tidewater region. The lines that you're seeing there is just a trend line. So all that line is saying is, was there an effect on the data with maturity? And if you look at the purple line, for instance, it's fairly flat. There was no difference in the Tidewater whether you had an early maturity variety or a late maturity variety. They all yielded roughly the same within a bushel. Um, Contrast that with what we saw in the Coastal Plain. This is actually shocking to me because I didn't conceptualize that this year. I thought actually we'd see a little bit of a bump up on the later maturities, but I did expect the early maturities to have an advantage because we did not have an early season freeze, that March freeze that we normally see. So they did not get dinged by that, and they were able to finish out and fill out before we got into that hot, dry weather. So you actually see an advantage about a 10 bushel advantage from the earliest to the latest if you look at our coastal plain environments. And again, that's Lenore County and Robinson County. The other cool thing about this is it kind of visualizes what our maturity range is within the OVT. So you have one line that's really early. That's our AGS 3022, and that's before 2200 GDUs. And then you've got four lines that are on the later side, after 2500, and then a big grouping of lines anywhere from 2250 all the way out to 2450, just a little bit over. So it's good to look at it this way because you can look at the effect of maturity on yield by region, but you can also look and see kind of what our distribution of maturities were for the test this year. In the past, we've been skewed towards the early side. Here, we're a little bit more evened out within that early, medium to medium late category. So that's what our seasons looked like up to or that's what our season looked like for wheat. Anybody have any questions? And I'll say, if you don't want to, go on mic, I've got the chat window open. I'm happy to answer questions on chat as you have them. But does anybody have any questions or comments on the season? Okay. If not, we're going to move on to where we can find the data, and then we're going to deep dive into the variety selection tool and how I would make selections based off of that. And one thing I'm realizing is I did not pull up the OVT website. So we're going to do that real quick. Hopefully you're still seeing what I want you to see here. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go to the OVT website, and then I'm going to go to, and I apologize, I should have had this set up before. So two ways of finding the OVT data. One way is through the OVT website. So you can go to ncovt.com. You can look for small grains 2025. And then this has all of our data tables listed out. So these are all of our static data tables, our location summary tables for commercial wheat, our data tables for commercial wheat. We have FHB ratings. So we have scab ratings. Thanks to Dr. Christina Cowger, we put a large portion of these commercial lines into the scab nursery this past year, her mist inoculated nursery. So we have some really good ratings on our commercial varieties from this past year. So those are reported here as well. And then I have reports that I pull out of the variety selection tool and I list here. So this is an opportunity for, if you don't feel comfortable getting into the variety selection tool, you just want a real quick, easy answer to what did well, what didn't do well, what varieties should I be looking at. This is a good starting point. You can come here, you can look for the Excel data tables that I've got posted. You can look at the tables I've created. You really have a lot of different options to look at that data and figure out what works best for you, along with our oat and barley data, which is not included in the variety selection tool. So this is the first place that I would come to if you're wanting to look for data that came out of the OVT. But we're going to focus mostly on the variety selection tool because that's our best opportunity to look at comparisons across regions and across environments and really do a quick pull down of varieties that we're interested in looking at. So I'm going to go to that data tool, and you're now seeing that hopefully. Again, this is ncovt.medius.re. You don't have to remember that. It's linked on the OVT website, both here at the top where I say variety selection tool, but also on the sidebar. So if you ever come to the OVT website, ncovt.com, you can click on variety selection tool. It takes you right to the data tool that we're going to be talking about. So come here. First thing you're going to do is you're going to select wheat. You can see a lot of things happening. The one thing I focus on, and there's a couple things you can focus on. If you're wanting a single variety that you want to look at, you can click on Find Variety, or you can type that variety name. It's showing Agrimex or USG 3884 right now. This is just examples of what you can type in, but you can look specifically for that variety you're interested in. When I'm coming into the OVT data first, I usually look at OVT data because this gives me the entire view of everything that was tested and shows what has performed well over the last couple years in addition to what performed well this last year. So I'm going to go to this teal box and select that. And then it's going to ask you if you want to, how you want to build out your view. You can click on yield. That'll take you to a good view of how things look. I build custom, and then I look at yield, and I look at percent of trial mean. We've talked about this in the past, but I focus on percent of trial mean because it standardizes our yield level across regions and across years. We know, we looked at yield levels earlier on here. And we know there was fluctuations this year compared to what we saw last year in yields. And so if we try to do a raw yield look, it's going to get skewed not only by region, because we had the Tidewater did well last year. It skewed everything towards the Tidewater, but it's also going to skew by year. You know, some years going to do better than others. It may skew those raw yields there. So I typically look at, when I'm looking at this, I typically look at percent of trial mean. That doesn't mean you can't look at raw yield. Raw yield's available to you here. If you feel more comfortable using that, you can. So I'm going to look at percent of trial mean. I'm going to get rid of this sidebar so I can actually see things. When I'm first coming into this data, we always want to focus on 2 and 3 year data first, because that's going to be our best opportunity to find a variety that fits well for our operation. So if you scroll all the way to the right, and you can see I scrolled here with this bottom scroll bar, all the way to the right, you'll see we have 22, 23, or 2023 to 2025 averages. That's our multiple year data, okay? This usually is default sorted by state or multiple year highest to lowest. So that's where you see this total has a down arrow. That means it's sorted high to low just on this category. You can sort any of these categories, of course. You can click on Tidewater twice, and now it sorts high to low by Tidewater. You can do the same thing with Piedmont. But this is your opportunity to start by looking at any varieties that were doing well over multiple years. Now, what you're going to see here, you'll see some Ys, some Y1s, and some Ls. So Y1 means that this variety was in the test for just a single year. Y2 means 2 years. Y3 means 3 years. The L is just the total number of locations. I want you focusing just on the Y number, because we just want to look at varieties in this situation that have been in the test 2 or 3 years, okay? Because that's our best predictor of how they're going to perform. I'm going to filter out all these year one varieties. You don't have to filter it. You can just ignore the Y1s as you're looking at this. But you can't go in and filter in number of trial years to make sure that that's an easier view for you. So a number of trial years is greater than 1. I'm just telling the database I don't want to see anything that has a Y1 in here, and I'm going to filter those out. So looking at that, and I'm going to get rid of my little filter button here. Now we just should be looking at Y2 or Y3s, and that's what we're seeing here. So a lot of Y3s. There's a lot of consistency in entries into the wheat OVT. Wheat varieties don't have the same high turnover rate that some of the corn and soybean varieties we see do. So you're going to see a lot more Y3s in here, which is great, because that's really good opportunity for you to make a good selection. So now we have statewide multiple year sorted high to low. Now in this space, we have enough data that we don't have to look statewide. We can drill down and look at how they performed by region. So Della, I see you're on. We're going to talk about Della. I guess you'd be, what do you look, Della, when you're looking at this? Do you look coastal plain or do you look tidewater?
Coastal.
So for Della in the coastal plain, I'm going to sort by coastal plain here. And these high to low would be some of the best choices for Della. And some of these make sense. You know, we've seen 3118 on this list before. 3451 showed up. Shirley's absolutely been there before. AP 2000 has been there before. I will mention we have some lines, and this is a good example of that. The 16900 is now licensed. There is a commercial grower for this line, so you're going to see a name on this line moving forward. But prior to this year, it was an experimental line that didn't have a commercial home. There are a couple of those existing here. There should be, and I'll show you where to look when we get to the next table. There should be an opportunity for you to see if it's available or unavailable based off how we've designated it in the table. I'm going to skip it for now. It's going to be coming, but it doesn't have a name yet. And then I'm going to select the top. I'm at 8 right now. I'm going to select the top 10. So these would be 10 varieties. You can include 11 if once this one gets a name. These would be the top 10 varieties I would start with if I'm growing in the coastal plain. Okay. So once I've selected them here, I can click on compare, and that takes me to a different window that will now allow me to look at all of the characteristics of these varieties. Before, I was just looking at performance. I was looking at percent of trial mean or raw yield, if you want to look at that. But I didn't have all the other data, right? I didn't have the disease tolerances. I didn't have available, unavailable. I didn't have head type. I didn't have a lot of other things. So now we're in that space here. And they've got them listed, you know, left to right, these top 10, where they come from, the years they were tested in. It looks like these are all 2 year varieties. Should be 3. I don't know why it's showing 2. But you see the company they came from, their head type, which is important. It's becoming more important with the amount of deer pressure we're getting. On onless varieties have a little bit more pressure on them from deer than onletted varieties. Their disease ratings, and I'll again mention that head scab ratings are primarily from the misinoculated nursery that we did with Dr. Cowger. So these are updated as of this year. A lot of other disease ratings, of course, a lot of these we collect. These are all from us. We don't pull in, disease ratings from external companies. So these are all generated from us, which means typically they are opportunistic diseases, which means we have to see them in the field and they have to exist at a range that we can do ratings. So that's why you're going to see some gaps here. We have not had a chance to get powdery mildew and leaf rust ratings on 543. You'll see the yield over all the locations. You'll see the percent trial mean. What that means is how did it perform against an average of all the other varieties in the test. Anything 3% or higher, we're interested in looking at. Again, this is statewide. When it pulls into here, even though we pulled it from a coastal plain view, this data is statewide. So it's going to look different than what you saw before, but we know that these are good fits for that coastal plain environment. It's going to show top yield group percentage. So this is a percentage of time that it was in that top yield group, or from the old tables, that bolded or green area, it was in that top yield group. So something like USG 3451 was in the top yield group over 3 years, almost half the time. And again, that's across statewide. It's going to show you maturity. So a lot of these are in that medium to medium early kind of area. Height with inches, its lodging potential, and then we get quality data that also comes in. So again, from locations like Union, Rowan, and Perquimans, we pull samples that we take back to the grain quality analysis lab. That allows us to get percent protein, allows us to get falling number from those varieties. Now, this falling number is an average. So if you click here, it's going to say, well, this just is from Union and just in 2024. Looks like we just have Union last year for this data. But typically, this will show as an average. It's just showing the 1 year. But when you're looking at falling number, you're only wanting to look at the prior year because falling number is so heavily influenced by the environment we're testing in. So in this case, it's just showing 1 year. I don't know why.
I think we asked Brad to do that.
Did we force it into a single year look?
I'm pretty sure we forced it. We need to talk to him about being able to see the other years, but without averaging it. I think he misunderstood.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're kind of
Um, but then can I also interrupt for just a second?
absolutely.
So I think you just misspoke when you said the lodging number is a potential for lodging. This is not true. It is a opportunistic rating that we take when lodging occurs. And so you can only use this number like this is how much lodging occurred on average if lodging occurred in the field. If you've got a zero, that does not mean that crop cannot lodge. It just means we did not observe it lodged that year.
Yeah, sorry. I did mistake misspoke peak there. That's just what we recorded in the field. So there's a potential for lodging for all varieties. It's just that's what we've seen in our data. So you have a lot of views at characteristics across these varieties. This allows you to filter out, particularly on the disease side, things that maybe I want something that's got more resistance to head scab. Well, I'm going to pull in 543. I'm going to pull in 1991. But those are probably the two out of these 10 that if I'm really worried about head scab, that allows me to filter down even further to the choices that I'm going to have. Same thing for quality. Again, year by year, if I'm wanting something with a higher falling number, 3451 is going to do well, 7222 is going to do well. Um, you know, you have that opportunity to filter down to the characteristics that you're interested in. Instead of taking 10 to your retailer or to your seed provider, you can take a list of 5 based off the characteristics that you find here. Angela, do you might want to make a comment on what like a optimal falling number would look like?
Yeah, so I'll say something about falling number and then also something in addition to that on variety choice. So um, all the falling numbers that you see here, all but two of them would likely be accepted, no questions asked, in or maybe three. So these that fall below the 350 threshold, and that 343 would probably get accepted as well. those would all be acceptable at milling quality. I would say 261 would give me pause. That's SH 5123. Anything under 300 is that's probably pretty heavily pre-sprouted. In this case, it isn't really clear that that was based on anything other than weather, which is why we ask you to look at a single year. Because if we look at the GDUs to heading, we have a lot of other varieties that fell in that same space but didn't also suffer from the low falling number. Uh, this is a metric, just like test weight, that the mill will adjust a little bit on either side, given the year, what they will accept. But once they go below a certain number, we're considered pre-sprouted and they can't accept that for milling. Generally, 325 is that bottom threshold. Somewhere between 325 and 350 is where they will set that bottom threshold, and everything above that gets accepted. I would say in general, unless we have a really severe weather issue or things stand in the field much too long, we tend to have falling numbers across all varieties that meet those metrics. So I mean, it's a great opportunity that we have this data, but it should not be like you're in your top three of items you're looking at to make your variety selection. It's just an extra piece of data that you can use if you're growing for milling quality wheat. And then if you'll scroll back up to the disease ratings. So, looking across the board, we're always thinking head scab, head scab, head scab. So, Ryan jumped out and picked out those MRs immediately. But here in this lineup, we also have, some lines that have a very good ratings for powdery mildew and leaf rust, which we tend to see more frequently than head scab. Like head scab's the one that scares us, but we see powdery mildew and leaf rust more frequently across the board. So you might pick up USG 3673 and SH 7222, which are MS to head scab, MR and R to powdery mildew and leaf rust, if your program includes a at flowering fungicide. Those would be varieties I would absolutely keep in my list.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, that the thought process around, at least for me, disease tolerance and varieties is not only what region am I in. In the coastal plain, typically we don't see a ton of head scab. It's not true that we never see head scab, but we don't see a ton compared to like a Piedmont, particularly a southern Piedmont. So, for me in a coastal plain, particularly a southern coastal plain, leaf rust is going to be more important because I'm going to see a leaf rust more often than not. But that's going to vary based off of not only the region that you're in, but also the production practice. What fungicides am I using? Am I using any fungicide? Am I counting on variety resistance to help me through and not have to spend that money on fungicide? But the data here gives you the opportunity to kind of fit what your choice is to what your not only environment is, but what your management practices are. So,
And in coastal plain, Della, we don't have full data here, but Hessian fly would be one of my top items to pay attention to as well.
so I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna go ahead and link this list into chat so that you don't have to write this down. You can literally just click on the link in chat. It'll take you to this exact view, and then you can play with it if you're interested in just coastal plain varieties later on. After you've forgotten anything I've told you today. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I want to do a quick deep dive into one variety because I want to show you where we have multiple years of like falling number or the metrics. Um, so again, we're looking at compare here. These are the varieties here on the left that we're looking at. There's this little, it looks like a booklet icon. You can click on that. That takes you to the specific information just for that variety. Typically, we have links to tech sheets where they're available. So if you're not seeing data here and want to make sure that you've not missed any data that exists, this will take you to the company tech sheet. Again, we don't support what's in that tech sheet. We're just giving you the opportunity to look at that data. In case there's something that we don't have or have not provided. So there's that, but there's also, if you click on data, this is all the data for this variety for the entire time that we've been testing it. So in the case of USG 3118, this is 6 years worth of data, right? So the way we were looking at it before, we're just looking at the last 3 years because the last 3 years, we can go further than that, but 3 years worth of data is a really good indicator of how that variety is going to perform. If you want to go even further, you can. You can look at how USG 3118's performed over 7 years. Um, yeah, seven. And, looking at percent of trial mean, obviously it has to fit in the coastal plain because it's 15% over 7 years. Like it's done really good in the coastal plain. Same for Tidewater. Again, my floor is 2 to 3%. So anything above 2 to 3%, particularly over multiple years, is really good. It has not performed as well. It's at average in the Piedmont. It's not that it's a bad variety. It's just not at the top like it is in the coastal plain Tidewater. But the cool thing is you can scroll down here and you can just hover over falling number. Why is it? Okay, I see. Because it's by year. Here's a good example. Because we don't usually pull samples from the coastal plain. But you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years worth of falling number data from 3118. And this kind of demonstrates how seasonal or how environment specific falling number can be, because this variety has been anywhere from 333, 337, all the way up to 441. Same variety over 7 years, but different environments that it experienced every single year. And because falling number is so environment specific, you're seeing a large variation in how that's performed. Typically, as long as it's within a range, we feel pretty good about how it's doing. Angela, do you want to say something?
Yes, so I know this is kind of maybe hard to get to if you're not really used to this tool, but this is the place where you would be looking at falling number if you're trying to use that. So, like, if you think about if we took an average of these numbers, they're not really giving you a good picture of the moments when it can fall below what the mill would require. This may not be a great example here just because it does pretty well in general. But in that year where we were, 337, or in, for example, the SH 5123 number, the year where we're in the 260s, 250s, understanding something about that crop year would be what helped you make a decision. Do I grow it or not? Because again, in general, our falling numbers are going to be milling quality if we're harvesting on time, and we haven't had any kind of significant, storm damage, rain event, or something right at maturity. So this would be the place that you would want to look and see those items across the board. In this case, USG 3118 should meet the standards in most years,
Yeah.
but an average number of all of these wouldn't tell you that story.
This is a good, so again, we're working on the following numbers from this last year. From Piedmont, we know that there were some extreme pressure, low pressures on falling numbers from wheat being cut by growers out there this year. Our hope is we can get that data processed, but in the process, prior to getting that information from us, this is your opportunity to go in and look at how consistent were some of the varieties I'm interested in over the years when it came to higher falling number. Um, so USG 3118 is a good example of being good. I'll go to 5123. I don't know that we have multiple years of data
I don't
on
think we
that
have a
one.
bunch on that one.
No, we just have three, but I think we
Yeah,
should have.
there's
Uh,
two there. So you can see in 23 it did much better and would have met the standard. Another one that we could check in that regard if we get to it is the GP line that had one poor year. I don't remember which one it was, but
381.
yeah.
Okay.
But we don't have to mess with that right now. It's unless someone's really interested. I'm not sure that Della's folks are sending a whole lot to the mill.
So that's a lot of information at this point. Anybody have any questions? Again, I've got chat open if you don't want to unmute. Okay, so this is what I would start with. Della, this is a good starting 10 for you for Coastal Plain to talk to your growers about. We won't end at multiple year. We'll get into single year first, single year in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and do a quick selection for Piedmont and for Tidewater for multiple year as well. So I'm going to close this window out. Now I'm just going to look at Piedmont high to low, like I did for Coastal Plain. I've left the varieties selected from what we had at Coastal Plain because I wanted to show you how these aren't necessarily the same varieties across regions. USG 3451 is common from what we saw in the Coastal Plain, But outside of that, Shirley might make the top 10, but none of the other top 10 that you had are showing up in the Piedmont. That's the differences that we see in environments. Yes, you can make selections based off of statewide data, and you'll be very successful there. But what you're missing are the opportunities to find those varieties that may not have shown up well, statewide, but have done really well in the environment or region that you're in. If I'm a Piedmont grower, I'm going to have, yes, 3451's done well in Coastal Plain. It's done well in Piedmont, but I've got Cropland 8045, Southern Harvest 9520, Dynagrow 9120. I've got other options, got Harvey's 1987 that I can pull that may not have looked well in Coastal Plain. Okay, so I'm going to deselect the ones I had in Coastal Plain. I just wanted to show you how that changes when you look at different regions. And I'm going to click the top 10 here. It counts for me, so I don't have to I don't have to count myself. So there's your top 10. Okay, so this will be top 10 selections, multiple year data off of Piedmont. Again, I'm going to pull that into compare. We're not going to deep dive like we did in Coastal Plain. Everybody's kind of aware of how to look at that data. But what I am going to do is go ahead and link this selection as well into chat. So you can click on the link. You don't have to uh, write down or remember what I showed you here. But just wanted to show that, and I don't think Shirley didn't make the top 10 here. No, it did not. I want to show kind of outside of 3451, you had a different set of selections that you can make from that region. And that's really, for me, that's the power of using the data this way. The static data tables are fine. And we tried to, particularly the reports that we pull out of the variety selection tool, we tried to customize them in a way that you can make kind of the same selections by looking at how they performed on a percent trial mean basis across regions. But the flexibility to look at that yourself really exists within this tool here. All right, so that's Piedmont. I'm going to do the exact same thing for Tidewater, just real quick, so we have that. Again, I left Piedmont selected. You can see that. Again, I don't think Buster's going to make the top 10. None of the top 10 for Piedmont match the top 10 for Tidewater. Um, so there's really that difference that exists there. So I'm going to just select these, do top 10. You remember Shirley. Shirley was, I think, the 10th on the Coastal Plain. It was number one for us in the Tidewater. Has been a very strong variety, and I'll show you how long we've tested it here in a second. So this would be my top 10 for Tidewater. Again, multiple year data, and I'm going to pull that in and link that into chat for everybody. Okay, so that's our starting point. We've looked at varieties that have done well over multiple years. That's where the majority of my acreage, I would like the majority of my acreage to go because we have confidence in how those varieties can perform based off of what we've seen across multiple environments, across multiple years. We can feel good about making that selection that it's going to do well for us in the environment that we selected it in. I wanted to highlight Shirley real quick because it's kind of an anomaly. I think we've tested this line I want to say 10 years at this point. Yeah, we're getting close. So 6, 7, 8. We're at 8 years testing for that variety. But this is an example of where we can get to if we have enough number of years that we can check on a variety performance. Again, there's your following number across multiple years, but it's kind of an oddball. We don't see varieties like Shirley. USG 3118 is probably the next longest that we've served in here, but it's a good example of how we can flesh this data out and feel pretty good about how that performance is going to be. Shirley does well in the coastal plains. Shirley does well in Tidewater. Shirley's above 3% in Piedmont. Like I said, it was just past that top 10. And top 10 is a very hand wavy number. You could select the top 15 or however many you wanted to. I do top 10 just for conciseness and speed. But you can choose as many as you want. But it's done well across multiple regions, and that's why it's been a pretty popular variety for growers. All right. So, any questions on multiple year data?
Yes, so can you stop here? This is where you made the selections for the Tidewater.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to just highlight a little bit deeper into exactly what Ryan just said. We chose the top 10 here. If you keep looking down, if you keep looking down the Tidewater column, if you'll just highlight that column with your just cursor there. If you keep looking down that column, you see we've got a lot of things in the blue still maybe 10 more lines even,
Yep.
okay, that are not statistically significantly different from anything we selected. All of these lines from Buster down to, that NC experimental line would fall in the same category as all the top 10 that he selected. So just, he said hand wavy, I say arbitrary, right? You could have chosen the top 20 and made your selections from there. And in fact, it might be to your advantage to, start with those instead of try. I know it's hard to like scroll across and everything, but it may be better to start with that bigger group and then start pulling down selections and filtering with the other characteristics outside of yield that you want to look at. Because if you go deeper into this list, you're going to get a wider variety of disease resistance packages. And you're probably going to also get a little bit wider range on your maturity. And those are the two places where you should be looking next. Um, we didn't really talk about this here, but if you're choosing out of the very tippy top um, of the variety selection, our test, we've been doing such a great job in the last several years that any genetics that are matching that find themselves in different bags are going to stack up with each other in this test. And you might have a good probability of selecting the exact same genetics out of two different bags to plant on your farm. There's nothing we can do to tell you how that happens, right? We know it's happening. So your best bet is to take that larger list and then go in and look at maturity. And that's a way that you can avoid doing that because it's unlikely that if you have, 100 um, points between your GDUs that you're getting the same genetics. Those are going to stack up really close to one another in general so that all right, if this GDU is 35 or 2500 and I've got a 2500 right next to it that's in a different bag, I probably want to select something down the line so that I'm not getting similar genetics and possibly stacking my risk against me from the beginning. Does anybody have questions about that? It's generally something Ryan doesn't want to talk about, so I jump on here so that I can.
So like, with top 10 here, the three you feel confident about being unique are the three USG lines because they're the same company, different varieties. But she's right. You're going to see some common genetics that cluster together. Using that GDU value is a good way to not only identify that might be common, but to get your separation into different genetic backgrounds. When I pull data into variety selection tool reports that I put onto the OVT website, I pull above average or what I call above average. Anything that you see in blue is considered above average. Okay, that's where I'm making that determination. So if this thing is in blue, it's good, it's above average, it's a good opportunity for you to look at it as a potential selection for you. The green is the tippy top, the white is right at average, and then anything yellow to red is going to be your below average or your lowest value within that data set. So that's multiple year data. If nobody has any questions, we'll move on to, okay, I've made a couple of selections based off of my multiple year data. This is my tried and true. This is how I feel very confident that these are going to perform for me based off Ryan's data and how they perform for him in my region. But I can't stop there. I shouldn't stop there because while turnover within wheats, fairly slow compared to corn and soybeans, it's not static. There is turnover within the wheat varieties that are available to us. And so we need to look at single year data to make sure that we've got some options for varieties that are going to be coming out on the market, are going to be new, but we know how they're going to perform based off how we've grown them in our operation and how Ryan's looked at them, on a single year data basis. So in that case, we're going to look at what's called 2025 averages. This is just from last year. We're not looking at multiple year data. We're just looking at data from last year. I've got to pull my 1 year data back in because otherwise I've got it filtered out and it's going to be a very small list. So I can get rid of that. Okay, we're just going to look at 2025, just single year, and I'm just going to sort statewide. So this is just looking at how these varieties perform. It doesn't matter if they're in the test 1, 2, or 3 years. We're just looking how they performed last year. Yes, we are interested in the Y1s. Here, our target's the Y1s. We've pulled out the Y2, Y3s based on what we just saw, right? Looking at that multiple year data, we've already pulled out the varieties that did well over multiple years for us. So here we're going to focus on those Y1s because that's what we're most interested in, opposite of what we saw with multiple year data. So I started high to low statewide. I cannot sort by region here. I can't sort by region because I don't have enough data. We only have two locations for Tidewater and Coastal Plain. Yes, we have three locations for Piedmont, so we're closer, but we still don't have enough data to say confidently that it's going to perform a certain way in a region. We're going to use the region performance to confirm our choices, but we're not going to make those choices based solely off how they did in that region. Okay. So I'm going to look here. I'm going to scroll back over just so I have a better view of my Ys. I've already pulled USG 3451. So I'm going to look at KWS. I'm going to look at this MAS. These are single years. This USG 3755 is a single year. And this KWS. And I think Agramax. So again, I'm doing 10 just for the sake of brevity here. Do as many as you want. Again, same thing that Angela was talking about before. Anything in that blue is going to be a good choice or a starting point for you. And you can go pretty far on a single year basis before you get out of the blue. You can go like almost 30, 40 varieties in. I'm just doing top 10 so that we can kind of make this a very short exercise and not a long one. So I'm going to go down. I'm at 9, so there's 10. All right, so you're going to see a bunch of KWS lines. You're going to see there's a USG line, there's an Agramax line, and an MAS. I'm going to pull these in to compare. But remember when I was saying before that there are some lines that have gotten into this commercial test that are not available commercially. When you look at availability here, those are going to be pulled out right away. So these KWS lines are all licensed lines. They should be in experimental tests. They're going to be in the experimental test moving forward, but they got into the commercial test this past year. We're still reporting them this way, but I wanted to make you aware that they're not commercially available. They will be. I'm almost certain they will be, just not in a KWS bag. They'll be in a USG bag or a Dynagrow bag or another company's bag. They're just not going to show up as KWS. So that data will still be valuable because we'll be able to have multiple year data on that. It'll just be named differently. But to distinguish that for you, here at the bottom where it says availability, unavailable is what we've marked for those lines that are not currently commercially available. MAS is Mid-Atlantic Seeds. They do sell varieties down here. I'm not sure where the retail point is, and that's something that we're working on in the background. Is for some varieties where we don't have if I come to you and say, "Where's Mid-Atlantic Seed sold?" You're probably not going to know. So we're going to see if we can collate what those retail opportunities or those buy point opportunities are for those varieties, not just for MAS, for all of the varieties that are in the database. Our goal is to try to get that kind of built out and kind of integrated into this so that you have an option to say, "Where's MAS sold?" and you can click a button to get to that point. We're not there yet, but that's a goal moving forward for us. But same option like you were doing for multiple year data. Now I've got a good comparison. The KWS lines are going to fall out for me just because they're not available. Let's look at this MAS lines. Look at this 3755 line, so on and so forth. The bigger thing I'm going to do is come back to what we were looking at before, and I'm going to look at, okay, I'm not doing KWS, but let's look at this USG line. It did well statewide. It did well in the Tidewater. It did really good in the Piedmont. So the darker the blue color, the higher it is in that kind of range of above average, right? So that darker blue color indicates it did really pretty well in the Piedmont. A little bit lighter blue means it was still above average, just on lower end of that above average scale. So if I'm a Piedmont grower, I feel pretty good about giving this a shot. Not that it did poorly in the Tidewater and Coast Plain. It's still an option there, but for sure, if I'm a Piedmont grower, I feel good about that one. Agramax 566, similar thing. Did really well on the Piedmont and good in both the other two regions, above average. So that's something that I would be interested in. Um, let's use 3118 as an example. Obviously, we've already pulled it out for multiple year data, but this is an example of how I'm using now my regions to kind of determine am I really interested in this or do I need to, consider something different? Sorry. So if I'm looking at USG 3118, yes, did well statewide, did well Tidewater, did well in Coastal Plain, but it's in that yellow category for Piedmont. Now we saw that already. We've over multiple years we know that this is the trend. But if this was a single year variety, right? Like I'm looking at this as a Piedmont grower and I'm like, well, maybe there's some other options. Maybe that USG 3755 is a better option for me. And it is, it's 97.4 bushels versus 89.7. So, looking at this, yes, I have to start with statewide. I'm sorting by statewide, but I'm also pulling across and just seeing kind of how these perform. Agramax 543, we've already pulled it out of other looks because it's a multi-year data variety, but if I'm looking at the single year, didn't it do as well in Tidewater, but did really well in Piedmont, did well in the coastal plain? If I'm a grower in those two regions, I'm interested in that line. But that's how I'm looking at single year variety data. It's a try for me. It's not going on a majority of my acres. I might put it on a field or two, but I'm trying it so that if I lose one of my tried and true varieties or one of the multiple year data varieties later on, I've got something in the queue. I've got some experience with a MAS number 190 or Agramax 566. I've got experience with that variety, and I can then integrate that into my production practices, once I've lost some of the more tried and true varieties. So that's where I'm looking. That's how I'm making selections initially. Again, I'm pulling it into compare, and then I'm looking at, obviously we're not going to have any disease ratings outside of scab from this past year because we didn't have any opportunistic diseases outside of scab that we rated this last year, but we'll have all the other data. Following number is not in there yet because again we're still in process of processing, in the process of getting that analyzed. But you do have GDU, so you can see kind of early to late how those fell out. And again, they actually run the gamut. So we're as early as 2200 and we're as late as 2500. So we've run early to late across the entire, most of the entire range of our GDUs. So I will link this one in just as a statewide general selection, just so you can look at it later on. And again, you can look at more than just the top 10 that I've looked at here. Okay, that is kind of all I have for the data webinar. I just wanted to give you an idea of not only how the season went for us this past year on the OVT side, what we saw, but ways that I approached looking at this data not only on the OVT website, but also within the variety selection tool itself, so that I can make selections that make sense for me if I was a grower in any number of these regions. So with all of that, does anybody have any general questions about the data itself, or is there a different look that you'd want to look at? Are you interested in looking at other characteristics that we've not talked about here today? Della, did we answer all your questions?
Yeah, I'm good. I would just say, after each crop harvest that you do on OVT,
Hmm.
and you create those Excel sheets and whatnot, send them out, just keep doing that.
Yeah.
Because even though it's been, I don't know how many years, 5, 6 years, maybe more since the Green Book's been printed, people still ask for the Green Book.
Oh yeah. No,
So I said,
that's
here's your newest Green Book version right here.
It's been 10 years, Della.
Yeah, it's been a while, see? They say time flies when you get older, and I'm feeling it. But I appreciate y'all doing this.
yeah, no problem. I do want to, so to Della's point, I send out these. So this is a Excel file of the data table she's talking about. I gotta get this pulled in the right view. You're not seeing anything right now. Um, But this is an example of what Della gets or the agents get, right? So very similar looks. Again, I'm looking at above average. I'm looking at things in that blue category. This is all data out of the variety selection tool. So I'm just doing pulls for you and I'm putting it in a table for you. And I'm looking at percent trial mean. I'm sorting yield to high to low, but you can then look across. This is statewide multiple years. So this is just varieties that are in tests 2 or more years. And you can see how they performed. You can find Southern Harvest 9520. You know, if you're just looking at a statewide data table, you're looking at these and you're like, oh, this is where I need to be. If you're a grower in the Piedmont, you're missing an opportunity at growing 9520. It's done well 3 years in the Piedmont. It's above 3%. You know, the good example here is, well, USG 3118. It's a good example, but it's a known example. You know, coastal plain grower. If that variety is available, this past year or last couple of years, it's not been in the top like it was when it first came out. But it's still a very good option for you in the coastal plain. But this is an example of the tables that you can find on the OVT website. These are what I send out to DELA. Same thing for statewide, just single year data. We have that sorted high to low for yield, and then we've got it indicated by how it performed across different regions. So if you're not one that wants to, mess with a database and searching and everything else, you don't have to. You can go straight to these data tables that are on the OVT website. This is the same views you're getting out of the variety selection tool. The only thing you're missing here is you can't look at, excuse me, you can't easily look at quality data like falling number of percent protein or disease data. You're just looking at performance data here. But if you find a couple here that you like, you can go on to the variety selection tool, just type in the variety name, and it's going to pop up the disease information. So you have multiple ways of getting to this data that's not just a database that you have to figure out how to use. So.